Continuing with Unit 2.2, we're continuing with our conditional statements, the ones that are written in if-then form. Now, conditional statements have related conditional statements called converse, inverse, and contrapositive statements. These are formed by doing several things to your initial statement. So, to find the converse, you actually exchange or switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So if you look here, our original statement where two angles are vertical, then they are congruent. They switched it. Now it says if two angles are congruent, then they are vertical angles. So they're switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. To find an inverse statement, you're going to actually leave it in the same order. So hypothesis stays hypothesis, conclusion stays conclusion, but you're going to give the negation or the not. So instead of saying two angles are vertical, you would say two angles are not vertical. Instead of saying then they are congruent, you would say they are not congruent. So you leave everything in the same order, but then you use the word not or the negation. To find the contrapositive, you're actually going to do both of these. You're going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion and do the word not. So you're going to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, and you're going to use the not or the negation of the statement. So instead of saying two angles are vertical and then they are congruent, they switch it. But now they're saying they're not congruent, they're not vertical. So let's go ahead and look at an example on our own. So here we're going to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. And then we're going to determine whether each one's true or false. If it's false, we're going to give a counterexample. So we're going to do several things in this problem. We're going to write our statements, determine true or false. If it's false, we'll find a counterexample. So our statement is if a polygon is a square, then it has four sides. We're going to start by finding the converse. And the converse is where you switch the hypothesis and conclusion. Here the hypothesis is a polygon is a square. The conclusion is it has four sides. So we switch them. We would say if a polygon has four sides, then it is a square. So we're just switching the order of how they wrote the problem. It doesn't have to be word by word like mine. We could say if a shape has four sides, then it's a polygon that is a square. As long as you're switching the four sides in the square, that's the important part here. Next, we're going to write the inverse statement. The inverse is where you leave it in the same order, but you negate or you use the word not. So instead of saying if a polygon is a square, we're going to say if a polygon is not a square. Instead of saying then it has four sides, then we will say then it does not have four sides. And lastly, we're going to write our contrapositive statement. For a contrapositive statement, we're going to have to do both. We're going to switch and we're going to use the word not. So instead of saying if a polygon is a square, then it has four sides, we're going to do it kind of like the converse. We're going to say four sides, but we're going to say if a polygon does not have four sides. And then it's saying then it is a square, then we would say then it is a not a square. So now that we have our three statements written, we have our converse, our inverse, our contrapositive. The question also wanted us to determine whether these are true or false. If they're false, we're going to give a counterexample. So let's look at our converse statement. Our converse statement said if a polygon has four sides, then it is a square. So they just told us it has 4 sides. Think of if there's any shapes that have 4 sides that aren't necessarily a square, where there's a lot. Square would have all sides equal. Sometimes you might have like a rectangle. So this would be a false statement. And for a counterexample, we could say a rectangle you could have also used like a rhombi, sorry. So there's different shapes there that aren't necessarily squares that have 4 sides. Our next statement says, if a polygon is not a square, then it does not have 4 sides. So we want to know if this is true or false. Well, if it's not a square, we know then it does not have 4 sides. Well, we could actually use the same statement from before. We have rectangles. Rectangles are not squares. But rectangles do have 4 sides. So here we have an example that's not a square, but it does have 4 sides. This statement says it does not have 4 sides. So this would be a counterexample. So we had to choose an example that was not a square, and then we wanted to check, okay, it's not a square, does it not have 4 sides? Since this one did have 4 sides, that makes this statement false. Our contrapositive says if a polygon does not have 4 sides, so we can pick any shape that does not have 4 sides. So let's say like a triangle. Then it is not a square. So this is not a square, so far it's true. Let's pick other shapes just to be safe. We could pick like a pentagon. This does not have 4 sides. It's not a square. Any shape that you pick that doesn't have 4 sides is not going to be a square. So their contrapositive is actually a true statement. So again, your converse, you switch the hypothesis and conclusion. Your inverse, you leave it the same order, but you use the word not, or you negate it. Your contrapositive, you're going to do both switch and negate your statements. And then to check if they're true or false, you want to test out your hypothesis. So based on your hypothesis, choose an example, and then check if it makes the conclusion true or false.